The candles in the Mayfair ballroom burned too bright, and the air smelled of wax and fear. Elira Doyle stood at the very back of the crowd, her hands pressed together beneath a heavy gray veil, listening to her own heartbeat, as if it belonged to someone else. She was not meant to be looked at. She had told herself this since the carriage ride, since her father pushed her toward the door with a grip too firm to be gentle. Tonight, women were being sold like prize horses, dressed in their best gowns, paraded before lords who wanted a wife the way they wanted a new hunting dog. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had promised herself many things. The room was full of lace and gold and whispered cruelty. Lady Constance Ray stood at the front, her golden curls catching the candlelight, her smile practiced and sharp. Everyone already knew how the night would end. The Duke of Ashworth would choose her. He always chose the obvious answer. He was a man of duty, not feeling, and duty always pointed toward beauty and rank. Elira watched him enter the room. Duke Alaric Vane moved like a man who had already decided the evening bored him. He was tall, dressed in black, his jaw set with the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the last week at his grandmother's sickbed rather than at his club. He did not want to be here. He had told his grandmother as much, and she had told him, in her failing voice, that this was the last thing she would ever ask of him. So here he stood, forced to choose a bride from a room of strangers, as though marriage were a transaction settled over tea. Mrs. Agatha Finch, the auction's organizer, clapped her gloved hands together and called the room to order. She had a voice made for theater, loud and sweet and completely without warmth. "Tonight," she announced, "the Duke of Ashworth honors us with his presence. Let every lady here remember what is at stake. A duke's hand can lift a family from ruin." Elira felt her father's eyes on her from across the room, sharp with warning. Baron Percival Doyle had sold the last of their land 3 months ago. He had gambled away what remained of their name. He had brought her here not to find her a husband, but to erase his debts, using her like a coin passed from one desperate hand to another. She was not even supposed to be a true candidate. Mrs. Finch had only allowed her to stand among the women because her father begged, and because a girl standing quietly at the back cost nothing to include. The bidding, if it could be called that, began. Lords stepped forward one by one, offering small compliments and smaller promises to women who forced smiles onto trembling faces. Alaric watched with visible impatience, arms crossed, eyes half closed, until Mrs. Finch gestured grandly toward Constance. "Lady Constance Ray," she said, "accomplished, admired, and eager to serve as your Grace's Duchess." Constance stepped forward and curtsied low, her eyes lifting to meet Alaric's with practiced confidence. The room held its breath. Everyone expected the match to be settled in that instant, but Alaric's gaze had already slipped past her. He was looking at the veiled woman standing near the wall, half hidden behind a pillar, as though she wished the marble might swallow her whole. She was not dressed like the others. Her gown was simple, unadorned, clearly mended more than once. She stood apart, not because she wanted attention, but because she seemed to be trying to disappear. "Who is that?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Mrs. Finch blinked, caught off guard. "Your Grace, that is only Miss Doyle. She is not truly a candidate, a companion, merely standing in attendance." "She is veiled," he said. "Why?" "A private matter, Your Grace, nothing that concerns." "I did not ask if it concerned me. I asked why." The room had gone very quiet. Constance's smile faltered, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it breaks entirely. Elira felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and for one terrible moment she could not breathe. She had spent months learning how to be invisible, how to fold herself into corners, how to let other women shine so that no one would ask her questions she could not answer. Now the most powerful man in the room was asking about her, and she did not know whether to be afraid or something else entirely. "Come forward," Alaric said. She did not move at first. Her father's hand found her back, pushing her gently, urgently, the way a man pushes a cart toward a cliff because he has already spent the money the cart was meant to earn. She stepped forward on legs that did not feel like her own, the veil trembling with each breath she took. "You need not lift it," Alaric said, more quietly now, though the whole room still listened. "I only wish to know your name." "Elira," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Elira Doyle, Your Grace." "Miss Doyle." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not read what. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a refusal to do what the room expected of him. "I have made my choice." Mrs. Finch's mouth opened, then closed. "Your Grace, surely you mean—" "I mean precisely what I said. He turned toward the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "I choose Miss Elira Doyle." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the room erupted into a storm of whispers, gasps, and one sharp intake of breath from Constance, who stood frozen at the front, her golden curls suddenly looking less like a crown and more like a costume nobody wanted anymore. Elira's knees nearly gave beneath her. She had come to this ballroom expecting to be furniture, a shadow at the edge of another woman's triumph. She had never imagined the shadow would be chosen instead of the light. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I believe there has been some mistake." "There has been no mistake," he said. "I have never been a man who explains his decisions, Miss Doyle, and I do not intend to begin tonight. But I assure you, this was not made in error." She wanted to protest further, but her father's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent command more binding than any word. Behind them, Mrs. Finch was already recovering her composure, already turning the moment into a performance for the crowd, declaring the Duke's choice bold, unconventional, the mark of a man unafraid to see beyond appearances. The words sounded rehearsed even as she invented them. Constance did not move from her spot near the front. Her eyes, when they finally found Elira's veiled face, held something colder than anger. It was calculation. It was the look of a woman already deciding how she would take back what she believed had been stolen from her. Across the room, an older woman watched everything unfold from a high-backed chair near the fireplace. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Vane sat with a cane resting against her knee, and an expression that gave away nothing at all, though her eyes had not left Elira since the moment the girl stepped out from behind the pillar. There was something in the old woman's face that looked almost like relief, as though she had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment to happen, and had finally watched it arrive. Nobody else in the room noticed. Nobody but Elira, who caught the Duchess's gaze for one brief second before it slid away again, hidden behind the practiced calm of a woman who had spent a lifetime keeping secrets. The carriage ride home was silent. Elira sat across from her father, her hands folded in her lap, the veil still covering her face, though there was no longer any reason for it. Baron Doyle stared out the window, his relief plain on his face, already counting the debts this marriage would erase, already forgetting to ask his daughter whether she wanted any of it. "You understand what this means," he said finally. "For the family. For everything." "Yes, father," she said, "I understand." She did not tell him that her hands were shaking, or that her heart had not slowed since the Duke first said her name. She did not tell him that somewhere beneath the fear, something else was stirring, something she did not have a word for yet. She only stared out at the passing streets of London, at the gaslights flickering against the dark, and wondered what kind of life waited for a woman chosen not for her beauty, but for a reason no one had bothered to explain. Behind her, in a grand house not far from the ballroom, Duke Alaric Vane stood at his window, looking out over the city he had never much cared to understand. He did not know why he had chosen her. He told himself it was simple defiance, a refusal to be predictable, a private rebellion against a life built entirely from expectation. But some quieter part of him knew that was not the whole truth. There had been something in the way she stood apart from the others, something that felt less like coincidence and more like memory, though he could not say why a stranger's veiled face should stir anything in him at all. In her private chambers, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Vane sat before her fire long after the household had gone to sleep. She held a small portrait in her lap, one she had kept hidden for many years, and she studied it now with an expression somewhere between grief and quiet triumph. "At last," she murmured to the empty room. "At last, he has found her." The fire cracked and settled, and outside, London slept, unaware that the choice made in a crowded ballroom had already begun to unravel secrets buried for a generation. The betrothal notice appeared in the London papers 3 days later, printed in small, precise letters that somehow carried the weight of an earthquake. Elira read it seated at the narrow table in her father's shrinking townhouse, her tea gone cold beside her, the words blurring slightly no matter how many times she blinked them into focus. Miss Elira Doyle, daughter of Baron Percival Doyle, to wed His Grace the Duke of Ashworth. She had read it 7 times, and still did not believe it belonged to her. Her father had not stopped smiling since the auction. He walked through their half-empty house as though it were already restored to its former grandeur, humming old tunes, speaking to the servants who remained with a warmth he had not shown in years. Elira watched him, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. His joy was not for her. It was for the debts that would vanish, for the creditors who would stop knocking, for the life he had nearly gambled away and now believed he had won back through her. "You will want for nothing," he told her over breakfast, buttering his bread as though the conversation were as simple as the weather. "A duke's wife. Think of it, Alira. Think of what your mother would say. Alira set down her cup carefully, afraid her hand might shake if she did not. Mother would ask whether I wished for this. Her father's smile faded only slightly. Wishing is a luxury for those who are not drowning. She said nothing more. There was no arguing with a man who had already decided the shape of her future. She rose from the table and went to the window, watching the street below, where a carriage bearing the Ashworth crest had just arrived to take her to her new home. She would live now among people who had never once had to wonder where their next meal would come from. People who would look at her plain gowns and her guarded manner and wonder what a duke could possibly have seen in her. Ashworth House was larger than any building Alira had ever entered. Marble floors stretched before her like frozen lakes, and portraits of long-dead Vanes watched her pass with painted eyes that seemed to judge her plain traveling dress. A row of servants stood at attention near the entrance, their faces carefully blank, though Alira caught more than one curious glance directed at the veil she still wore, even indoors, even now. "You may remove that here," said a voice from the top of the staircase. Alira looked up to see the Dowager Duchess descending slowly, her cane tapping against each marble step with the patience of a woman who had never once been rushed in her life. Up close, Margaret Vane's eyes were a pale, striking blue, and they studied Alira with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Alira said. "I am more comfortable this way." Comfortable or hidden? The Duchess reached the bottom of the stairs and stood before her, close enough that Alira could smell lavender and old parchment. "There is a difference, my dear, though most people never learn it." Alira did not answer. The Duchess studied her a moment longer, then reached out one thin, ringed hand and touched the edge of the veil, not lifting it, simply resting her fingers there, as though testing whether the fabric was real. "You have your mother's hands," the Duchess said softly. Alira went very still. "Your Grace, I do not believe we have ever met." "No," the Duchess agreed. "Not you and I. Not yet." She withdrew her hand and straightened, her expression closing over again like a door swinging shut. "Come, I will show you to your rooms. You must be tired from the journey, though it was hardly a long one." Alira followed her through the halls, her mind circling back again and again to those 5 strange words. Your mother's hands. She had never spoken of her mother to anyone at Ashworth House. She had never spoken of her mother to anyone at all, not since the day the woman had vanished from Alira's life, when she was only a small child, leaving behind nothing but a single portrait her father had burned in a fit of drunken rage years later. How could a duchess she had never met know anything about her mother's hands? She did not have long to wonder before Alaric found her in the east corridor, standing outside the door to what would become her private sitting room. He looked less tired than he had at the auction, though no less guarded, as though he too were still deciding what to make of the choice he had made. "Miss Doyle," he said, "I trust my grandmother has not overwhelmed you." "She is perceptive," Alira said carefully. "She is many things. Perceptive is among the kinder of them." A faint smile touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I wish to speak with you before the household grows too accustomed to treating us as a settled matter. I do not know you, Miss Doyle. I chose you on an impulse I have not fully explained, even to myself. I think it only fair that you understand I do not expect anything of you beyond what any reasonable arrangement requires. Companionship, civility, perhaps, in time, something more, if we are fortunate." Alira studied him from behind her veil, grateful for the fabric that hid whatever her face might have revealed. "And if I told you I did not choose this? That I stood in that ballroom because my father demanded it, and said yes to your proposal because refusing was never truly an option for a woman in my position?" Something flickered across his face, there and gone. "Then I would tell you that I understand more of that feeling than you might expect. I did not choose this life either, Miss Doyle. I inherited it. We are both perhaps playing parts written before we were born." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, and it caught her off guard enough that she nearly lifted the veil herself, simply to see his face clearly when she answered. She did not. Old habits held too tightly to be broken by one honest sentence. "Thank you for that, Your Grace," she said instead. "I will try to be a reasonable wife. And I will try to be a reasonable husband." He hesitated, then added, "You need not call me Your Grace in private. Alaric will do." "Then you may call me Alira." He nodded once, as though sealing a bargain, and left her standing in the corridor with her heart beating strangely fast, caught somewhere between fear and a feeling she refused to name. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alira learned the shape of the house, the names of the servants, the particular silence that fell over the dining room whenever the Dowager Duchess entered. She wrote to no one, for there was no one left to write to, and she spent her quiet hours in the library, where at least the books did not ask questions she could not answer. It was there on the fourth day that her father arrived unannounced, brushing past the footman with the confidence of a man who believed his daughter's marriage had erased every debt he owed to propriety as well as coin. "Elira," he said, settling into a chair across from her without invitation. "I have come to discuss the settlement. The Duke's man of business mentioned a sum, but I believe there is room for negotiation, given the circumstances." "Given what circumstances, father?" He waved a hand vaguely. "The delicacy of your situation, your mother's history. Certain families pay handsomely to ensure certain truths remain buried." Elira's blood went cold. "What truths?" Her father's smile faltered, as though he had said more than he intended. "Nothing that concerns you. Simply matters between men of business." "Father." Her voice sharpened, cutting through his practiced evasion. "What do you know about my mother that I do not?" He stood abruptly, smoothing his coat, avoiding her eyes with the particular skill of a man who had spent years avoiding difficult truths. "Your mother is dead, Elira. Whatever secrets she carried died with her. Do not go digging in graves you cannot close again." He left without another word, and Elira sat alone in the library long after the sound of his carriage faded from the drive, turning his warning over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. Whatever secrets she carried died with her, but the Duchess had spoken of her mother's hands as though she had known them well, and her father had just confirmed, however unwillingly, that there were secrets to be found. That evening, a note arrived for her, slipped beneath her chamber door by a hand she never saw. She unfolded it with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps a note from a well-wisher, or a household matter requiring her attention. Instead, the words were sharp and cold, written in a hand disguised to hide its owner. "Some veils are worn to hide a face. Yours hides a lie. Remove it before the truth removes it for you." Elira read the note 3 times, her heart pounding against her ribs, before folding it small and pressing it into the hidden pocket of her gown. She did not know who had written it, or what exactly they believed they knew. But she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that whatever secret her mother had carried to her grave had not stayed buried after all, and that someone in this house, or close to it, already knew far more than Elira herself did. She glanced toward the window, where the lights of Mayfair glittered against the dark, and wondered, not for the first time since the auction, whether choosing to hide her face had ever truly protected her at all, or whether it had only delayed the moment when everything she feared would finally come to light. Sleep did not come easily after the note. Elira lay awake through most of the night, staring at the canopy above her borrowed bed, listening to the house settle around her with its unfamiliar creaks and sighs. By morning she had decided one thing with certainty. She would not run from whatever truth waited to be found. She had spent her whole life folding herself smaller to survive her father's mistakes, and she was tired, deeply and completely tired, of being a woman defined by other people's secrets. She began, quietly, to watch the house. The Dowager Duchess kept to a strict routine, rising early, taking her tea alone in the small parlor overlooking the garden before any servant dared disturb her. Elira started joining her there, uninvited at first, simply appearing with her own cup and waiting to see whether she would be turned away. She was not. The old woman watched her over the rim of her teacup with something that might have been approval, though she said little on those first mornings beyond comments on the weather or the roses just beginning to bloom. It was on the 5th morning that the Duchess finally set down her cup and studied Elira directly. "You have been watching me," she said. "I am neither so old nor so foolish that I have not noticed." "I did not mean to be obvious," Elira admitted. "You were not obvious. You were patient. There is a difference, and it is not one many young women possess these days." The Duchess folded her hands in her lap. "You wish to ask me something. I suggest you simply ask it, rather than circling the question like a bird afraid to land." Elira drew a slow breath. "You said I have my mother's hands. I have never told you my mother's name, and yet you spoke as though you knew her. I would like to understand how." The Duchess was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the garden window, toward some point in the distance that had nothing to do with the roses. "Your mother's name was Helena," she said finally. "Helena Ashford, before she married your father and became a Doyle. She was, for a time, very dear to this family." "How dear?" "Dearer than I am permitted to explain today." The Duchess turned back to her, and for the first time, Elira saw something almost like sorrow in the old woman's pale blue eyes. "I am not being cruel, child, when I withhold the rest. I am being careful. There are people in this city who would use the full truth to destroy what little peace either of us has left, and I intend to choose the moment of its telling with great care. Trust that I will tell you when the time allows it. Trust also that the truth is not something you need fear. It was not enough, but it was something, and Alira understood, watching the careful set of the Duchess's jaw, that pressing further would earn her nothing but a closed door. She let the matter rest, for now, though she carried the name Helena Ashford with her for the rest of the day like a small, precious coin. That afternoon, Alaric found her in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath an old oak, turning the mysterious note over in her mind for perhaps the 100th time. He sat beside her without asking permission, which she had already learned was simply his way, a man too accustomed to command to think of asking before acting, though never unkind in the doing of it. "You seem troubled," he said. She considered telling him about the note. She considered, too, how quickly trust could become a weapon in the wrong hands, and how little she truly knew him beyond a handful of conversations, and one impulsive choice in a crowded ballroom. In the end, she settled for a partial truth. "Your grandmother tells me my mother was once dear to your family." She will not say more. Alaric's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "My grandmother does not share her secrets easily, even with me. I confess I know little of your mother beyond her name, which I only recently learned myself." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I will say this. My grandmother is not a woman given to sentiment without reason. If she speaks fondly of your mother, there is a story behind it, and I do not believe it is one meant to harm you. You believe that, or you hope it." He considered the question honestly, which she was coming to understand was simply how he answered most things. "Both, I think. Is that not allowed?" A small, unwilling smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, hidden safely behind her veil. "I suppose it is." They sat together a while longer, speaking of smaller things, the garden, the household, a play he had once seen and found tedious beyond words. It was, Alira realized with some surprise, the first truly easy conversation she had shared with anyone in longer than she could remember. For a moment, she nearly forgot the note folded away in her hidden pocket, nearly forgot the fear that had kept her awake the night before. The moment did not last. 2 days later, Lady Constance Ray arrived at Ashworth House uninvited, sweeping past the footman with the same confidence she had shown at the auction, though her smile now carried a sharper edge. She found Alira in the small parlor, alone, and settled herself into a chair as though she had been invited to tea. "Miss Doyle," she said, her voice honey over something colder. "Or should I say, the future Duchess. How fortunate you have become, and so quickly." "Lady Constance." Alira kept her voice even, though her pulse had already quickened. "I did not expect your visit." "No, I imagine not. Few people expect the things I do." Constance's eyes swept over her, taking in the veil, the plain gown, the whole quiet mystery of her, with visible distaste. "I confess, I have wondered a great deal about what the Duke saw in you. A woman who hides her face, a woman with no fortune, no connections, nothing to recommend her beyond a father's desperate maneuvering. It is a puzzle I intend to solve, Miss Doyle, whether you assist me or not. I have nothing to hide beyond a private matter of my own choosing. Everyone says that, right up until the moment their secrets are dragged into the light." Constance rose, smoothing her skirts, her smile never wavering. "I only came to offer a piece of advice, woman to woman. Whatever you are hiding beneath that veil, I suggest you prepare yourself. Society does not forgive mysteries, Miss Doyle. It only postpones the reckoning." She left as swiftly as she had arrived, and Alira sat alone in the parlor afterward, her hands pressed together to still their trembling. The note, the visit, the Duchess's careful silences, everything seemed to be circling closer to some truth she could not yet see, and she felt, for the first time since the auction, a genuine fear that whatever waited to be discovered might unravel the fragile peace she had only just begun to build. That evening, she sought out the Dowager Duchess again, finding her in her private sitting room, surrounded by old letters and a fire burning low in the grate. "Someone left me a threatening note," Alira said without preamble. "And today, Lady Constance came here specifically to warn me that my secrets would soon be exposed. I do not know what secrets she believes I carry, Your Grace, but I believe it is time you told me everything." The Duchess set down the letter she had been holding and studied Alira for a long measuring moment. "Sit," she said finally. "You are right. I have waited long enough, and I will not have you frightened by whispers when the truth is far less frightening than the rumors surrounding it." Alira sat, her heart hammering, and waited. "Your mother, Helena, was the daughter of a dear friend of mine, a woman I loved as a sister," the Duchess began. "When Helena was young, before she ever met your father, she was betrothed to my son, Alaric's father. It was a match arranged with great affection on both sides, not merely convenience. But circumstances intervened, and the betrothal was broken before the marriage could take place. Helena was sent away in some disgrace, though the disgrace was never truly hers to carry. She married your father not long after, a man far beneath what she deserved, and I lost track of her for many years, though I never stopped wondering what became of her. What circumstances broke the betrothal? The Duchess's expression tightened, old grief surfacing despite decades of practice hiding it. That is a story for another evening, child. Tonight, understand only this. When I learned, quite by accident, that Helena's daughter had grown into a woman living in quiet poverty, hidden away by a father who saw her only as a debt to be settled, I made certain that Alaric would attend that auction. I did not know you would be there among the women being offered. I only hoped, if fortune favored us, that he might find you and recognize something in you worth choosing, even without understanding why. Elira sat in stunned silence, the pieces rearranging themselves into a shape she had not expected. You orchestrated this, the auction. His attendance, all of it. I orchestrated an opportunity, the Duchess corrected gently. The choice itself was entirely his own, made without my guidance, made in the moment, in front of the whole of society. That, my dear, is not something I could have arranged even if I had wished to. Whatever drew him to you that night came from something deeper than my scheming. It was too much to absorb all at once, and Elira sat with the weight of it pressing down on her chest, torn between gratitude and a lingering unease she could not quite name. If the Duchess had gone to such lengths to bring her here, what else remained hidden, waiting for its own careful moment to surface? And if Constance already suspected there was a secret worth uncovering, how long could any of it truly stay buried? Your Grace, Elira said quietly. If Lady Constance learns even part of this, what will it mean for us? The old woman's eyes hardened, some of the sorrow retreating behind a colder, more familiar resolve. It will mean, my dear, that we must be faster than she is. Truth revealed on our own terms is a gift. Truth dragged into the light by an enemy is a weapon. I do not intend to let Constance Ray hold that weapon over this family, not while I still draw breath to prevent it. News of a stranger's return reached Ashworth House before the man himself did. Captain Edmund Hale had been away at war for nearly 3 years, and his sudden arrival in London sent a ripple through the households that remembered him, though none of those ripples reached Elira until the morning he appeared, unannounced, at the edge of the garden where she sat with her embroidery untouched in her lap. Elira, he said, and something in the way he said her name, worn and careful, told her instantly who he was before she even lifted her eyes. She had known Edmund since childhood, back when her family still held land worth visiting, back before her father's debts had swallowed everything they once possessed. Edmund had been the son of a neighboring family, a boy who taught her to ride and to fish and, later, a young man who had promised her, in a quiet moment neither of them ever spoke of again, that he intended to marry her the moment his fortunes allowed it. Then the war had called him away, and the promise had gone unspoken for so long that Elira had convinced herself it belonged to a different life entirely. Edmund, she rose quickly, her heart doing something complicated and painful in her chest. I did not know you had returned. 3 days ago. He studied her, his eyes moving to the veil with open confusion. You are veiled, and betrothed, I am told, to the Duke of Ashworth himself. I confess I hardly know where to begin making sense of either fact. It is a long story. I have time, he said. I have thought of little else but returning to you these last 3 years, Elira. I would very much like to understand what has changed. She led him to the stone bench beneath the oak, the same bench where she had sat with Alaric only days before, and told him as much of the truth as she dared, leaving out the deeper mysteries surrounding her mother, speaking only of the auction, her father's debts, and the strange, unexpected choice that had brought her to this house. Edmund listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening more with every sentence. Your father sold you, he said finally, the way he might sell a horse. He would say he saved our family. He would say many things to avoid looking at what he has done. Edmund reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though something in her hesitated even as she did. Elira, I made you a promise once. I know years have passed, and I know circumstances have changed a great deal, but I have not forgotten it, and I do not believe you have either. Edmund, I am betrothed. Betrothed by an auction, to a man who chose you on a whim. That is not the same as a marriage built on years of understanding, on a promise made freely, between two people who actually know each other's hearts. His grip tightened slightly. Tell me you feel nothing when you look at me, and I will leave this house and never trouble you again. Elira could not tell him that, and the silence that followed her hesitation said more than any words could have. She withdrew her hand gently, her thoughts a tangled mess of old affection and new uncertainty. I do not know what I feel, Edmund. Too much has happened too quickly. Please, give me time to understand my own heart before you ask me to choose between it and the life that has already been decided for me. He nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was plain. I will wait, Elira. I waited 3 years already. I can wait a little longer, if it means you choose truthfully in the end. He left soon after, and Elira sat alone beneath the oak for a long while, her thoughts circling between the promise of her past and the strange, uncertain warmth that had begun to grow toward the man she was now bound to marry. She had not expected to feel anything at all for Alaric, had entered this arrangement expecting only duty and distance. Instead, she found herself thinking of his honesty in the corridor, his quiet company in this very garden, the careful way he had told her he did not expect more from her than she was willing to give. It should have made her choice simple. Instead, it made everything far more complicated. She did not tell Alaric of Edmund's visit, not directly, though word of a returning captain calling upon the future Duchess traveled through the household staff quickly enough, as such things always did. Alaric found her that evening in the library, his expression carefully neutral in a way she was beginning to recognize as the mask he wore whenever something troubled him deeply. I understand you had a visitor today, he said. Edmund Hale. A friend from my childhood, recently returned from the war. Only a friend? Elira considered lying, considered the ease of a simple denial that would smooth over the tension gathering in the room. She chose honesty instead, remembering his own honesty toward her in the corridor days before. Once perhaps, something more was spoken of between us, before the war, before everything changed. Something flickered across Alaric's face, gone too quickly for her to name it with certainty, though she suspected it might have been jealousy, however carefully he tried to hide it. And now? Does something more remain? I do not know, she admitted. I did not expect to feel anything but duty toward this arrangement, Alaric. I did not expect Edmund's return to complicate what I believed I already understood. I am telling you the truth because you deserve it, not because I wish to hurt you. He was quiet for a long moment, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man working very hard to appear unaffected. I appreciate your honesty, he said finally. I will not pretend it does not trouble me. But I made a choice in that ballroom, Elira, and whatever uncertainty exists between us now, I do not regret it. I only ask that whatever you decide it honestly, and not simply because it is easier to choose the path already written for you. That is more understanding than I expected. I am learning, he said, with the faintest, tired smile, that expectation and reality rarely match in this house. That same night, the Dowager Duchess summoned Elira to her private sitting room once more, her expression grave in the candlelight. I have heard of the captain's return, she said without preamble, and I have heard, too, of the history between you. I will not pretend to know your heart, child, but I will tell you something I have carried silently for a long time, something that may help you understand why this match matters more than either you or Alaric yet realize. Elira sat, bracing herself. You said you would tell me, when the time was right. The time is now, I think, before matters grow too tangled to unravel cleanly. The Duchess folded her hands, her pale blue eyes distant with memory. Your mother, Helena, was not simply betrothed to my son. She was carrying his child when the betrothal was broken. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading through Elira's understanding faster than she could follow them. What are you saying? I am saying, Elira, that you are not merely the daughter of a woman once dear to this family. You are, I believe, the daughter of my son, and Alaric's half-sister by blood, though he does not yet know it, and though the truth of it was buried so carefully that even I did not learn the full certainty of it until very recently. Elira sat frozen, the implications crashing over her in waves too large to fully comprehend. If it was true, if she truly was Alaric's half-sister, then everything, the betrothal, the marriage, the whole shape of the future they had begun building together, would need to be entirely undone. Your Grace, she whispered, if this is true, then Alaric and I cannot possibly. I did not say it was certain, the Duchess interrupted, her voice sharpening with sudden urgency. I said I believed it, based on old letters and old timing, that never quite made sense to me. But there is another possibility, one I have only recently begun to consider, and one that changes everything if it proves true instead. She reached for a small, worn letter resting on the table beside her, and held it out with trembling hands. Read this, child. and tell me what you understand from your mother's own words." Illyra took the letter with unsteady fingers, unfolding paper gone soft and yellow with age, and began to read the words her mother had written decades before, words that would either confirm the family's darkest fear or unravel it entirely, depending on what truth had been hidden inside them all along. The letter was written in a hand Illyra had never seen before, and yet something in the careful looping script felt achingly familiar, as though her fingers remembered a mother her mind had long since forgotten. She read slowly, her breath catching more than once, the Duchess watching her in silence, allowing the words to speak for themselves. Her mother had written the letter to a friend, never sent, discovered only decades later among belongings passed quietly between families. In it, Helena confessed that she had broken the betrothal herself, not because she carried a child by the old Duke's son, but because she had fallen in love with another man entirely, a man her family considered unsuitable, and had fled the arrangement before anyone discovered the truth of her heart. She had married quickly afterward, to a kind but unremarkable gentleman, to protect herself from scandal, and that gentleman, the letter made clear, had died before Illyra was ever born. Baron Percival Doyle, the letter revealed, was not Illyra's true father at all. He had married Helena already carrying another man's child, accepting the arrangement in exchange for a dowry large enough to settle debts he had already begun accumulating even then, and raising Illyra as his own to preserve appearances he cared for far more than truth. Illyra looked up from the letter, her hands trembling. "Then I am not the old Duke's granddaughter at all. I am not Alaric's sister."
"No,"
the Duchess said, relief plain in her voice for the first time since Illyra had met her.
"you are not."
"I feared the worst when I first learned Helena had once been promised to my son, and I confess my caution nearly cost us dearly before I found this letter buried among papers I should have searched years ago. You are the daughter of a man named Gregory Ashford, a musician of modest means whom your mother loved deeply and lost far too young. Percival Doyle raised you, but he is not your blood, and I believe deep down, some resentment over that very fact explains a great deal about how coldly he has always treated you." Relief and grief tangled together in Illyra's chest, so complete and confusing that she could not immediately separate one feeling from the other. She had spent her whole life believing herself the daughter of a cruel, careless man, and now she understood that even that cruelty had been built on a lie he alone had chosen to keep. "Why did you not simply tell me this from the beginning?" "Because I did not know it myself until 3 days ago, when I finally forced myself to search through papers I had avoided for decades out of my own cowardice." The Duchess reached out and took Illyra's hand, her grip surprisingly firm for such an old, thin hand. "I am sorry for the fear I allowed to grow in the meantime. But you must understand, child, this truth changes nothing about the danger surrounding us now. Constance Ray and that dreadful woman, Mrs. Finch, are still determined to expose whatever secret they believe you carry, and if they discover even a fragment of this story twisted the wrong way, before we control how it is told, the damage could still be considerable." The warning proved well-founded sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Ashworth House hosted a grand ball, the first great event since the betrothal had been announced, and all of society arrived eager to study the mysterious veiled woman who had somehow captured a duke's attention. Illyra moved through the crowded ballroom on Alaric's arm, her nerves stretched thin beneath her calm exterior, aware of every whispering glance, every fan raised to hide a murmured judgment. Constance Ray arrived late, dressed in a gown of deep crimson that drew every eye in the room, Mrs. Finch trailing behind her like a general arriving with her army already assembled. Illyra felt the danger the moment they entered, some instinct honed by months of careful watching warning her that tonight would not pass without incident. She was right. Midway through the evening, as the orchestra paused between dances and the room settled into a lull of conversation, Constance made her move, stepping into the center of the floor with theatrical timing, her voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet. "I wonder," she announced, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "why our future Duchess still hides her face. Even now, even here, among people who will soon call her family. Surely, if there is nothing to hide, she might grant us all the simple courtesy of seeing the woman our Duke has chosen." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, curious and eager, the way a crowd always grows eager at the promise of scandal. Alaric stiffened beside Illyra, his hand tightening protectively over hers, but before he could speak, Illyra felt something shift inside her, a resolve settling over her fear like armor finally fitted to size. She had spent her whole life hiding, first behind poverty, then behind a veil, always afraid of what people might see if they looked too closely. She was tired of that fear ruling every choice she made. "You are right, Lady Constance," Illyra said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent ballroom. There has been enough hiding. She reached up with both hands and lifted the veil herself, slowly, deliberately, before anyone else could take that choice from her. The room fell utterly silent. Beneath the veil, Elira's face was unremarkable in the way society had always dismissed as plain, features soft rather than sharp. Nothing about her the kind of beauty painted into portraits or praised in poetry. But there, faint and unmistakable along the curve of her jaw and temple, ran a scattering of pale marks, the lingering trace of a childhood illness that had left her skin permanently marked, the very thing she had spent years hiding beneath fabric, ashamed of a body she had never chosen and could not change. For one terrible heartbeat, Elira braced herself for laughter, for gasps of disgust, for the cruel judgment she had feared her entire life. Instead, an older woman near the front of the crowd let out a small, startled cry and pushed forward through the gathered guests until she stood directly before Elira, staring at her marked face with an expression of pure astonishment. "Helena's mark," the woman whispered. "I would know it anywhere. I was there the night she was born with it, and I watched her daughter inherit the very same." It was Lady Bramwell, an old friend of the Duchess, one of the few remaining people alive who had known Helena Ashford intimately, decades before her disappearance from society. Her recognition, spoken aloud before the entire ballroom, did more to confirm Elira's true parentage than any private letter ever could have, transforming what Constance had intended as public humiliation into something else entirely, a living confirmation of a story only the Duchess and Elira had known until this very moment. Constance's triumphant smile collapsed into confusion, then something closer to panic, as the crowd's attention shifted entirely away from mockery and toward fascination, whispers rippling now with a different kind of hunger, the hunger for a story more remarkable than mere scandal. "She is Helena Ashford's daughter," Lady Bramwell announced, turning to address the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the very history she now revealed, a woman this family loved dearly, wronged terribly by circumstance and cruelty she never deserved. "I say it is long past time her daughter received the welcome her mother was denied." The Dowager Duchess stepped forward then, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age, and took Elira's hand firmly in her own, presenting her to the room with the unmistakable authority of a matriarch who would not be questioned. "This young woman," she said, her voice ringing clear across the ballroom, "is the granddaughter of my dearest friend, and the future Duchess of Ashworth, chosen by my grandson not for fortune or fashionable beauty, but for qualities this family values far more deeply. I would ask that anyone still inclined toward cruelty tonight direct it elsewhere, or leave my home entirely." The silence that followed held for only a moment before it broke into something unexpected, a scattering of applause, hesitant at first, then growing, as the crowd, ever eager to align itself with power and sympathy in equal measure, embraced the story the Duchess had just given them. Constance stood alone in the center of the floor, her scheme collapsed entirely, her face burning with humiliation she had intended for someone else. Mrs. Finch had already begun edging backward toward the doors, sensing correctly that her role in tonight's failed cruelty would not be forgotten kindly. Elira stood with her veil finally lowered around her shoulders, her marked face bare before all of society for the first time in her life, and felt, for the first time she could remember, something close to peace settle over the fear she had carried for so long. Alaric moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in front of the entire watching crowd. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, meant only for her, though his voice carried enough warmth that those nearest them could not help but overhear. "I chose you before I understood why. I understand a great deal more now." Across the ballroom, Edmund Hale watched the scene unfold from near the refreshment table, his expression unreadable, torn between admiration for the woman he still loved and quiet acceptance of a truth he had perhaps always known was coming. He did not approach her that night. He simply watched her stand tall before a crowd that had once been ready to tear her apart, and understood, with the particular ache of a man setting down a hope he had carried a very long way, that Elira's future no longer belonged to the promise they had made as children. The morning after the ball, London woke to a different story than the one Constance Ray had intended to tell. Every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with talk of the veiled bride revealed at last, of old scandal and older love finally brought into the light, of a duchess who had defended her chosen granddaughter before the entire assembled ton without a moment's hesitation. Elira, for the first time in her life, found herself the subject of sympathy rather than pity, curiosity rather than cruelty, and the strangeness of that shift left her feeling almost unmoored, as though she had stepped into a life built for someone else entirely. Baron Percival Doyle arrived at Ashworth House that same morning, his face pale, his usual bluster entirely absent. He had heard, as had all of London, that the truth of Elira's parentage was now common knowledge, and whatever comfortable arrangement he had imagined for himself, built on debts settled and appearances maintained, had clearly begun to crumble beneath him. "Elira," he said, finding her in the small parlor where the Duchess had first offered her tea weeks before, "I must speak with you." "You mean you must explain yourself," she said, without looking up from the letter she had been rereading, her mother's careful, looping script now familiar enough that she could almost hear the woman's voice within it. "Though I confess, Father, I am not certain explanation is owed to me anymore, given how little of the truth you ever intended to share. I did what was necessary to protect this family. You did what was necessary to protect yourself," she said, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. "You married a woman carrying another man's child to settle debts already piling up around you, and then you spent years treating that child coldly, perhaps resenting her for a truth you alone chose to hide rather than confront. I understand now why you always looked at me the way you did, Father. I only wish I had understood it years sooner, so that I might have stopped blaming myself for a coldness that was never truly mine to earn." Percival Doyle had no answer for that, his mouth opening and closing without sound, and Elira realized, watching him struggle, that she felt no satisfaction in his discomfort, only a quiet, settled exhaustion, the particular relief of finally understanding a wound well enough to stop it from bleeding further. "I do not hate you, Father," she said gently, "but I do not think we have anything left to offer one another either. You may go. I wish you well, truly, though I do not think I wish to see you again soon." He left without argument, his shoulders bowed in a way she had never seen before, and Elira watched him go with something closer to sorrow than anger settling in her chest. Grief not for the father she had lost, but for the father she had never truly had at all. Edmund Hale called upon her later that same week, arriving with none of the urgency of his first visit, his manner instead calm and resigned in a way that told Elira he had already made peace with whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I saw your face at the ball," he said, seated once more beneath the old oak in the garden, "and I saw the way the Duke looked at you afterward. I think perhaps I have known for some time that the promise we made as children was never truly meant to survive into the people we have both become." "Edmund, do not apologize," he said gently, cutting off whatever careful comfort she had been about to offer. "I loved you once, Elira, truly, and some part of me will likely always carry a fondness for the girl who used to race me along the riverbank without ever once letting me win. But I have watched you these last weeks, and I no longer see that girl entirely. I see a woman who has found something I could not have given her, no matter how long I waited. I am glad for you, even if it took me some time to arrive at that gladness honestly." "What will you do now?" "Return to my regiment, I think. Or perhaps settle at last into the quiet life I always claimed to want, and never quite managed to build." He smiled, faint but genuine. "Do not worry for me, Elira. I have survived worse than a broken promise. I find, standing here now, that I am rather more relieved than heartbroken, if I am honest with myself." He left that afternoon, and though Elira felt the quiet ache of an old chapter finally closing, she felt no regret trailing behind it, only the particular piece of a door closed gently, rather than slammed shut in anger. The wedding preparations that followed moved quickly, the Dowager Duchess overseeing every detail with the fierce efficiency of a woman, determined to see her long-held hopes finally realized. Constance Ray, disgraced by her failed scheme and abandoned by the very society that had once admired her sharp tongue, quietly withdrew from London altogether, retreating to a distant estate to wait out a scandal that showed no signs of forgetting her role in it. Mrs. Agatha Finch fared little better, her auction business collapsing entirely once word spread of her willing participation in Constance's cruelty, her theatrical voice no longer welcome in any ballroom that mattered. On the morning of the wedding, Elira stood before a tall mirror in her private chambers, dressed in ivory silk, her face bare, no veil in sight, only the pale marks along her jaw that she had once hidden and now wore without shame. The Dowager Duchess entered quietly, studying her with an expression of undisguised pride. "Your mother would be proud of you," the old woman said. "I only wish she had lived to see this day herself." "I wish that too," Elira said softly, "though I think, in some way, she has been guiding all of it from wherever she rests. It feels too remarkable to be entirely coincidence, all of it, the auction, the veil, the stations, the truth finally surfacing when it did." "Perhaps it was not entirely coincidence," the Duchess said, a small, mysterious smile touching her lips. Perhaps some things simply find their way home, given enough time and enough courage to see them through. The ceremony itself was small compared to the grand spectacle society had expected, held in the quiet chapel at Ashworth House rather than the great cathedral where dukes traditionally married, a choice Alaric had insisted upon when Alira confessed she wanted intimacy, rather than another crowded room full of curious eyes. Only a handful of guests attended, the Dowager Duchess seated proudly at the front, Lady Bramwell beside her dabbing at happy tears, a scattering of household staff who had come to genuinely care for the quiet woman who had joined their world so unexpectedly. Alaric stood waiting at the altar as Alira walked toward him, her face uncovered, her chin lifted with a confidence that had taken her an entire lifetime to earn. When she reached him, he took her hands in his and studied her with an expression she had come to know well over these past months, something steady and warm, and entirely without the coldness society had once assumed defined him. "I chose you before I understood why," he said quietly, echoing words he had spoken to her once before, in a ballroom full of judging eyes. "I understand now that some choices are simply recognition, arriving before the mind has caught up to what the heart already knows." "I did not choose to stand in that ballroom that night," Alira answered, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the edges of her vision. "But I choose this, Alaric. I choose you, freely, with nothing hidden between us any longer." They were married before the small gathered crowd, and when Alaric finally kissed her, gently, before witnesses who had once doubted her entirely, Alira felt the last of her old fear dissolve completely, replaced by something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and unshakably like belonging. Outside the chapel, London continued its usual business, unaware that a story once destined for scandal had instead become one of quiet triumph, a plain girl chosen at auction who had turned out to be far more remarkable than anyone in that crowded ballroom had ever imagined. Autumn settled over Ashworth House, with a gentler quiet than the storm that had carried Alira into it, and she found, walking the same garden paths that had once witnessed her fear and uncertainty, that the house no longer felt like borrowed ground. It felt like hers, in the same steady way a river belongs to the land it has carved over years of patient movement, one season folding into the next until the shape of things simply becomes what it was always meant to be. She had grown close to the Dowager Duchess in the months since the wedding, the two women sharing their morning tea in the small parlor, as easily now as old friends rather than cautious strangers testing the boundaries of a fragile truce. It was during one of these mornings, the garden beyond the window turning gold and amber, that the Duchess finally told her the full story of Helena Ashford, the woman whose blood ran through Alira's veins though her face had never been more than a half-remembered shadow from childhood. Helena had been vibrant, the Duchess said, quick with laughter, gifted at the piano in a way that drew crowds simply to listen through open windows on summer evenings. She had fallen in love with Gregory Ashford despite her family's disapproval, a musician of talent but no fortune, and had chosen him anyway, knowing full well the cost such a choice would carry in a world that valued rank above happiness. When Gregory died suddenly, before Alira was born, Helena had been left with nothing but grief and a child she was determined to protect, even if protection meant marrying a man she did not love, simply to give her daughter a name society would not question. "She sacrificed everything for you," the Duchess said, her voice thick with old sorrow, "and never once had the chance to see what that sacrifice would ultimately grow into. I like to imagine she is watching now, somewhere beyond all of this, and that she finds some peace in knowing her daughter found a kind of love she herself was never permitted to keep." Alira carried that story with her for weeks afterward, turning it over gently, grateful finally to understand the shape of the woman who had given her life before disappearing from it so completely. She began in small ways to honor that memory, learning the piano herself under a patient tutor, filling the halls of Ashworth House with music the way her mother once had, watching Alaric pause in doorways sometimes just to listen, an expression on his face she had come to recognize as the particular quiet happiness of a man who had once believed such warmth was not meant for him. Their marriage settled into something neither of them had expected when it began as an impulsive choice in a crowded ballroom. Alaric proved, beneath his careful reserve, to be a man of surprising humor, given to quiet observations that could catch her laughing at the most unexpected moments. Alira, in turn, brought a steadiness to their household that the servants noticed and quietly appreciated, a warmth that had been entirely absent under the previous management of a family more concerned with appearances than genuine care. Word came, some months later, that Constance Ray had married a minor gentleman of modest fortune in a quiet ceremony far from London, her ambitions for a grander match finally exhausted by the scandal that had followed her failed scheme. Elira felt no satisfaction hearing the news, only a distant, faded curiosity, the particular indifference that comes from having moved so far beyond a conflict that it no longer holds any real weight. Edmund Hale wrote once, from his regiment, a short letter expressing genuine happiness for her marriage and gentle news of his own life, moving steadily forward without regret. Elira read it with a soft, fond smile, folded it carefully, and set it aside, grateful for the peace it carried, rather than any lingering sorrow. On a cold evening in late autumn, as rain traced patterns down the tall windows of Ashworth House, Elira sat with Alaric before the fire in their private sitting room, her head resting against his shoulder, the quiet comfortable in the particular way that only comes after months of building genuine trust between two people who once knew almost nothing about each other. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what might have happened if you had chosen Constance that night, as everyone expected?" Alaric considered the question seriously, his fingers idly tracing patterns against her hand. "I think," he said finally, "that I would have spent the rest of my life wondering about the veiled woman standing quietly at the back of the room, never understanding why something in me refused to look away from her that evening. I do not believe I ever truly had a choice, Elira. Not really. I simply recognized something true, long before I understood what I was recognizing." "That sounds remarkably close to fate." "Perhaps it was," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Or perhaps it was simply the first honest choice I ever made in a life built almost entirely from obligation. Either way, I have never once regretted it. Not for a single moment since." Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and inside, the fire burned warm and low, casting gentle light across a room that had once felt cold and unfamiliar to a frightened young woman hiding behind a veil, and now felt, in every quiet, settled way that mattered, entirely and completely like home. The story that London still occasionally whispered about, of the Duke who chose the plainest girl at the Mayfair auction, had long since faded into something gentler than scandal, softened by time into the kind of tale mothers told their daughters when they wished to remind them that true worth was never something easily seen at first glance, and that the bravest choice a person could make was often simply the choice to finally be seen at all.